give me this thumbs up when you have started YouTube. Great.
Worshipful Master, can you hear me?
Good evening, brethren. This is Ken Clay. Thank you very much for joining this evening's session. I very much appreciate it. For those that joined us via the Zoom session, I would appreciate it, please, if you would mute your phones, and we will continue with the session. I'm very pleased with this evening's agenda because it touches on each of my Masonic pillars. We're going to start with a brief update on my updated guidance. So that plays to my pillar of communications. Then we're going to have Right Worshipful Brother Troy Patuan, who's going to speak to us a bit about Masonic protocol. So that touches on our ritualistic excellence. Then Right Worshipful Brother Dave Ackridge is going to give us some Masonic education. And then lastly, Carl Olson is going to give us a presentation that touches on a number of my Masonic pillars. So I'm very much looking forward to this evening's agenda. I hope you all had an opportunity to go outside and enjoy this glorious day. It absolutely was beautiful. This is well deserved for us New Englanders. So I hope you had a chance to do that. So just a brief update, if you've not had an opportunity to see my guidance, just before I do that, I am going to make a comment, brethren. Regardless of whether you are observing tonight's session from Zoom or from YouTube, I would ask that if you have a question, that you please use the chat feature to ask your question, as opposed to coming off of mute for those that are on Zoom. All right, so make sure you use chat and make sure that you are all muted. So I issued some updated guidance this last Friday that was in direct response to the update that we received from the governor of the state of New Hampshire. Effectively, it has two components. The first is, as you know, back on March 16th, I issued an edict. Currently, our Grand Lodge Constitution does not allow worshipful masters in this grand jurisdiction to cancel stated meetings. So what my edict did is it empowered worshipful masters to be able to do that during this time of COVID-19. So my edict remains in effect. So if worshipful masters feel uncomfortable with holding stated communications, that is perfectly understandable. And therefore, my second set of guidance is that I am directing that worshipful masters throughout this grand jurisdiction cancel or postpone all in-person Masonic events until June 1st of 2020. Now, obviously, for those that have possession of buildings, there's general maintenance that has to take place. If you've got something of an urgent nature like plumbing or heating or electrical that needs to be addressed, certainly you can continue to do that. Please make sure that you use every caution available. However, if you've got things that are, kind of similar to hospitals, where if it's not a catastrophe and it's something that you can put off until May 31st or beyond, I would ask that you do that. Now, brethren, you're probably asking, eventually, this pandemic will be behind us, and we're going to have a chance to gather back together again as friends and as brethren. And so how do we do that? I want you to know that myself and the Grand Lodge line officers have been working on, I refer to it as a re-entry plan, and you'll be hearing more about that as we approach the end of May, as we approach that time when we all hope that we receive formal instruction from our governor that allows us to once again gather in person. So that is an update from me. I'm now going to turn the session over to Right Worshipful Brother Troy Patuan, who's going to speak to us a bit about Masonic protocol. Troy.
Thank you, Most Worshipful. Okay, so the Grand Master asked me to speak on Masonic protocol and whatnot. So just to start off, well, I like to start with a little bit about the worshipful master of a lodge. So basically, since time immemorial, the worshipful master has pretty much absolute power, almost absolute. He pretty much answers to no one except the Grand Master. He's pretty much bound by no rules except that of the Grand Lodge Constitution and bylaws of his lodge. And he has full control of debate in the lodge. Now, mind you, that for example, I remember once when I was going up through the chairs and I was at a master's class, and Right Worshipful Brother Lovell was giving us an example of such, and he basically said a master can pretty much make a motion, second it, close it, end discussion, and that's it. Can he do that? Yeah. Should he do it? No. Because one of the key elements of being worshipful master when you're elected, one of the major parts of protocol is to keep the harmony of the lodge. He's entrusted to do so. So use your best judgment. One thing you want to remember too as a worshipful master, or if you're in your lodge, is that when they're reading the minutes, or if even if the minutes aren't read, but they're outside for you to peruse, and he's asking if anybody has noticed any omissions or should there be any corrections, you don't have to vote on the minutes. The worshipful master is totally accountable for the minutes, so it's pretty much on him whether to decide if they're okay or not. Getting back to the harmony of the lodge, he controls who enters and who leaves the lodge. He doesn't have to allow someone in the lodge if he thinks it's going to disrupt the harmony. That's his number one priority pretty much in that position. Now, something that pretty much I couldn't really find written anywhere, but it's kind of an unwritten rule, is you never really turn your back to the master. So like if senior deacons, if you're giving him the word and you have to go up the steps to give it to him, when you go back down, you can sidestep it basically going down, but don't turn around and have your back. It's pretty much kind of a thing of respect for the worshipful master. Let's talk about the master's hat or tile. That definitely goes back to time immemorial, and in some jurisdictions it's considered a landmark. But always remember that the tile is pretty much it's an ode to respect for the office, not necessarily the brother who wears it. And if you happen to be wearing it and you're coming to the sign of fidelity, one thing you want to remember is your hand still covers your heart, and the tile will cover your left shoulder. So you don't put the tile over your heart. Your hand still goes over the heart, and the tile will be over your shoulder. Only one brother wears the tile. So if you have the pleasure of receiving your district deputy grand master or the grand master himself, if he's wearing the tile, you don't. Okay, more on manners and procedures and protocol. When you want to address the East Brethren, if you can stand, please stand, and you always go in the step of the degree, the due guard, and sign. That's very important if you're leaving or entering a lodge room. But when you're just looking to speak to the worshipful master, make sure you give the due guard and sign and remain on the due guard. We sometimes forget to give the sign, but it's something you need to do. And if several brethren stand up at the same time, he's going to pick someone, and the rest of you should probably sit down and wait again with a time with patience to stand back up if you need to address the worshipful master still. And keep your question or your topic to the subject at hand that's going on already in the lodge, and you want to pretty much keep personalities or anything that can excite the brethren, like ill discussion towards the lodge or even Grand Lodge, can be considered unmasonic. So try to keep that in mind. If you want to speak to another brother, you got to ask the worshipful master permission to address them. So again, just a simple courtesy and decorum that keeps harmony in the lodge and keeps things easier for the worshipful master to keep things organized. When you're addressing other brethren, A good thing to remember is, well, if you don't know if somebody is their style, if they're right worshipful or worshipful, the safe bet is always brother last name. But you should try to remember their style, or at least their position in the lodge. Like you'd want to address the senior deacon, brother senior deacon, or brother junior warden, worshipful master. Try to avoid using first names. We don't do that. So like brother Larry or brother Ken, you'd want to say their last name when you're addressing them, or most worshipful. Sometimes what we do, and I see this more in Grand Lodge, is when you want to leave the lodge room for whatever reason, or even enter it, I think sometimes we get a little awestruck by the size of the crowd in the lodge room, especially at Grand Lodge, and we pretty much try to avoid going to the center of the lodge to the altar, and we kind of like go towards the door and give the due guard quickly and skedaddle. You want to go to the altar when you would ask for permission to leave the lodge. It's hard, especially at Grand Lodge, for the most worshipful Grand Master to see where everybody is and keep track of everyone. And if you're kind of skedaddling out in the corner, he might not know you even left. So try to go right up to the altar, and when you want to ask permission to leave. Another thing that's when you're entering or leaving a lodge room, I think is very important. When you go to if the lodge is already in session and you haven't got to the lodge yet, the tiler's going to be outside the door. The tiler in the brother cannot just walk in the lodge room and open the door. The tiler's going to have to rap, and then the worshipful master will decide when it's time to answer that alarm. And he'll have the junior deacon do it. He should have the junior deacon ascertain the cause of the alarm. And if the brother's somebody that can be vouched for and is properly attired, he will go back to his station, inform the master, and then the master will have him come in, and he'll go to the altar, do guard and sign, and take a seat. Now, if the brother's not known to the tiler or the junior deacon, after the junior deacon reports it, the master will send out several brethren to investigate the brother who wants to enter and make sure he is who he is. Once that's ascertained that he's someone who can come in and join, he'll have the senior deacon go to the door, bring him to the altar, do guard and sign, and then introduce the brother. And maybe the master will come down and greet him, maybe not, but then he'll take a seat. Now, speaking of the altar, it's known that we should never pass between the altar and the east unless being conducted or the flag is being conducted. The courtesy is pretty much rooted in the belief that the master should always have the great lights in view. Also, for doing the entered apprentice degree, we have the 3 lesser lights, and they're displayed, and we don't want to pass between them and the altar. And that's based on a belief that the altar and the lights around it are a representation of the Sanctum Sanctorum, or the Holy of Holies of the original temple in the wilderness. So we kind of do a rite of remembrance. Remember, brethren, everything's symbolic, and that's one of the reasons why we do that. Also, regarding the altar, you should never decorate it or cover anything by unless it's like the Grand Lodge or your own lodge is banner, maybe a black cloth for a deceased brother. You don't really see that too often. You do a Grand Lodge, but that's something to keep in mind when regarding the altar also. Now, when it comes to balloting, I'm not going to really go into that because we could do a whole discussion on balloting. But in regards to the altar, the ballot box should never be placed on the great lights. So if the senior deacon doesn't wish to carry the box around, he can put it next to the great lights or something next to the altar. But that's pretty much it. And also remember, all the senior deacons out there, the ballot box should never leave the lodge room. So because basically you have the tile outside guarding. Now, if you want the tiler to vote, you pretty much have to inform him of what was in the investigative report. And you can do that a couple ways. Now, you can declare the anteroom part of the lodge. That way he can hear it. But even if you do that, you still can't let the ballot box leave the lodge room. That's a Masonic no-no. If you don't make it part of the lodge, then basically the senior deacon has to trade places with the tiler so he can vote. But still, the ballot box will not leave. Marshals. So here's one little thing I found interesting. When you're conducting the chaplain to the altar via the south, you always want to remember that he's going to be between you, the marshal and the altar. So basically, if you're taken from the east to the west, he's going to be on your right arm. When you're coming back, he'll be on your left arm. When a prayer is offered in lodge, okay, all the brethren come down on the level, except those in the back. They can, if they're in the second or third row, they can pretty much stay there as long as they come to the sign of fidelity. After the chaplain says amen, we all say so mote it be. Something to note in the Grand Lodge manual, they prefer that you say amen with a long A as opposed to amen. And Right Worshipful Brother Sprague reminded me that has to do with, I think, with when you're singing, amen is used opposed to the amen. So if you say the long A, amen, that's usually what's acceptable. I mean, no one's going to say anything otherwise, but just one of those things we find in the manual. If we're doing an obligation, that's a little different. The officer should come down the level. The brother on the sidelines don't have to. But in either case, you're going to go back to the your station as an officer when the worshipful master goes back to the east. One other thing here, so a couple of things. Senior deacons, when you're conducting the candidate, you're doing a circumambulation around the lodge, and you're going to each station, southwest and east. After that officer has spoken to you and he sits down, that's when you want to proceed on. You shouldn't take off or leave before he sits down. Just makes things look a little bit more snazzy. It's still out of respect. If you're doing a ballot in the lodge room, everybody needs to vote. Unless the worshipful master excuses you, you need to vote. Here's one thing that's really important in a lot of lodges. I don't think know this, and I've seen it actually done in a lodge. In the Constitution, a worshipful master can ask any master mason to perform in a degree or do degree work. Any master mason. So if you're an entered apprentice or a fellow craft, you shouldn't be taking a position in the office to help out. Just something to know. One last thing, brethren. No person should ever attend any meeting of a lodge whose charter has been suspended or canceled, or any lodge not recognized by this jurisdiction. Doing so could cause penalty of expulsion. And why I bring that up is this, because it kind of ties in with the Tyler and the secretary. We have that book of lodges that we get updated every year. It tells you which lodges are still recognized by us and whatnot. Always important to look at that, especially if you have a brother visiting your lodge. You certainly wouldn't want a clandestine brother coming to visit your lodge. You pretty much end up with a discussion probably with the Grand Master down the road. That pretty much does it for me. I could have gone on to a lot more subjects, but for the sake of time, I just picked up on a certain few that I think it's important to go over. And right now, I'm going to check the chat box to see if there's any questions or anything.
So, Right Worshipful, thank you very much. The
Yeah.
questions that I see predominantly deal with my portion of the presentation. So, brethren, let me give you a little bit of guidance in terms of the direction that I will be going when I announce a formal plan. So this is preliminary, but as of right now, what I am considering is a phased approach to us gathering together. Phase one will be the restart of face-to-face stated communications and special communications. Now, one of the questions was, if I've got an entered apprentice who's ready to take his lesson, do I have to wait until after May 31st? And the answer is yes, because that needs to be done in an open lodge, and that can't happen before May 31st at the earliest. So your plan should be that your candidate will be taking his, or your entered apprentice will be taking his lessons sometime after May 31st. So plan on stated communications and special communications to be the first occurrence where we can gather together face to face. The second phase will be the second phase will be for us to do degrees. Now, there's very particular reasons, and because this is a somewhat of an open forum, I'm not going to get into the details. We all know that there's conducting of candidates and whatnot that's involved. That means that social distancing is challenged when we perform our degrees. So the performing of degrees will happen at a later date. The third phase will be returning to be able to hold veterans and special ladies programs. Brethren, I think we all recognize that veterans and special ladies typically are within a demographic that is particularly vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus. And the last thing that we want to do is to have these folks come in. As much as we would love to receive them and let them know how much we care and appreciate their Masonic milestones, I personally do not believe that it's prudent for us to gather groups of these people together at this time. So veterans and special ladies programs will be introduced in the third phase. I believe that there was a question. Many lodges do not hold stated communications in July and August. If we might be able to resume in-person meetings this summer, we can always hold specials, but there may be some activities which bylaws may only permit at stateds. I can't supersede your bylaws, but take a look at the bylaws. So this is not a dispensation. This is not a Grand Lodge dispensation issue. This is you working with your lodge and your bylaws to, if you can call a special communication at any time, so long as you're very clear in what the purpose of that special communication is. So you can say, I am calling a special communication in the month of July when we were normally dark, but I'm doing it for the purpose of voting on a candidate, for example. Okay, so I hope that answered the questions. So there was a question, will we have to wear masks? I'm not going to answer that question now. If you were to ask me that question right here today, I would say that it would be encouraged, but I'm not going to insist on it. But we'll see where we are a month from now. CDC guidelines change over time, so let's see where we are then. I also want to make sure that you all understand that oftentimes we hold collations or public meals. Collations, there'll be very specific guidelines that I will be announcing with my plan. But when it comes to the serving of public meals in a dine-in situation, so I know there are lodges out there now that are doing wonderful things by offering meals to go for the needy, and I applaud them. I think that's a wonderful thing. But when it comes to dine-in meals, those will not happen until you have further guidance from me. And what I'll be doing is taking look at aligning with the recommendations from our governor and CDC on when restaurants in this state can open up, social gathering regulations, and those sorts of things. So these are all excellent questions, brethren. You're asking all the things that have already been considered. There is a plan that is in the works, and you'll hear more about that, as I say, probably in about 3 weeks. What about meals before stated when we are allowed to meet? So I believe that in all likelihood that you will be able to hold a meal, a collation before or after the stated meeting, but there will be very specific guidelines put in place. I will tell you that when I went to the 4th District Town Hall that was held at Hiram Lodge in Claremont, they did a fantastic job. This was just as COVID was becoming a bit of a concern, and as you recall, that's the last town hall we had before we had to cease operations. they did an excellent job, because what they did is there were 2 or 3 people that prepared all the food. They're the only ones that handled the food. When they handled the food, they were using proper things like gloves and whatnot. They were the ones that brought the food out. It was a buffet setup so that people were in line with their plates. The servers were the only ones that were handling the food, putting it onto the plates. The attendees did not touch the food in any way. They didn't touch any of the serving materials. And those brethren did an excellent job of making sure that all surfaces were cleaned before and after. You can probably look for guidance along those lines. I absolutely recognize the fact that meals, collations are part of the social element of Freemasonry. I want to respect that. I do want to reintroduce it when we reintroduce stated meetings and special communications, but there'll be some very specific guidelines that come out in conjunction with it. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have for now. I want to thank Right Worshipful Brother Patuan. I thought you did an excellent job with your presentation. Now, my brethren, it's a real treat for you, because tonight you're going to hear an educational, Masonic educational program from Right Worshipful Brother Dave Ackridge. My brother.
Most Worshipful, thank you so much for the invite to speak tonight. Good evening, brethren. My topic tonight is going to be cornerstones. And, you know, when I say that word, I suspect that there was probably this immediate visual in your mind. It may have been that perfect ashlar that sits in all of our lodge rooms. It may also have been, you know, perhaps an older building that's in your community, perhaps your lodge building, but I think that's kind of the visual you get. Why cornerstones tonight? Well, I think in the midst of this crisis, you know, I think that a cornerstone in its operative fashion certainly speaks to the very foundation, that primary setting stone, that foundation that sets the entire direction of the building, the support. It has to be true. And you know what? I think that when this crisis hit, our foundation, our cornerstone in Masonry was in fact very well grounded, very well set, because almost in an instant, we morphed to respect all of the restrictions, yet we continued in Freemasonry and we continued in formats like this. And it didn't happen, it happened really almost overnight. It was literally like flipping a switch. And I think in Masonry, we moved at light speed. And I think that's a good thing. But we're going to talk a little bit about, a little more about the speculative meaning of cornerstones. And, you know, going back to our operative, why the Northeast? In operative Masonry, the Northeast was often considered to be an auspicious, in some traditions of religion, you know, a spiritual place. And I'll kind of leave it at that. But we're going to talk a little bit about the speculative cornerstones. And certainly when we look at some of the things that Masons do in a very public way, you know, we had Right Worshipful Sprague last night or yesterday that talked about Masonic funerals, and he did so with the LOIs. You know, we have our veterans programs. You know, we have we have the Masonic funeral, and the Masonic funeral. What is our focus? It's on our departed brother and their family. When we do a veterans program or an installation, it's about those officers that are being installed or those veterans that we're honoring, but it's still very narrow. It's really almost within the confines of a very small group. But you know what? There is one thing that we can do publicly that is about the community, and that is our cornerstone ceremony. It is most of us, well, I shouldn't say most of us, because you know what? We may have seen the rededication or perhaps the dedication of a cornerstone in a lodge building. But you know what? We also have a ceremony for public buildings. And you know, the cornerstone ceremony is one that is very traditional to American Freemasonry. Many of us have heard and seen and know that, Brother George Washington, in fact, laid the cornerstones of our United States Capitol on September the 18th, 1793. The Capitol took some 100 years to complete, but it started with the very same cornerstone ceremony that we use today. And I know one need only walk through your town, and I suspect that you will see many a public building where we see the Masonic symbol and the date laid. Not so much in the last 25 to 50 years, but our old buildings, in fact, have that. Why is that? Well, cornerstone ceremonies have always been the strict provenance of Masons, always. And I think it probably goes back to Brother Washington and everything that he did. And we look back, and I know that Right Worshipful Olson can certainly share some of the details of some of the wonderful ceremonies that occurred in probably our communities in New Hampshire, with bands and parades and, perhaps in conjunction with the 4th of July celebration, because they were significant and Masons did it. And our Grand Master, and I know that Right Worshipful David Collins has spoken in our leadership institutes about visibility in the community. This is a wonderful opportunity for you to do that. And I think that for those of you who may not have had a chance to see one, I know many of us over on the seacoast have in fact had an opportunity to do it, because during the last 5 years, there have been such ceremonies. Under Most Worshipful John Gordon, the New Dover Police Station was dedicated with a symbolic cornerstone. Following this, and this was a huge celebration, as a kickoff to the bicentennial of our own New Hampshire State House, Right Worshipful Brother Smith coordinated the inclusions of Masons from across this jurisdiction to, in fact, rededicate the cornerstone of the New Hampshire Capitol building. What a day. What a day for Masonry to be on display. There was the processional, and we had many of the bodies, De Malay and York Rite and Scottish Rite, and we were all there, and we were there in huge numbers. And we were there once again to be able to show the community this age-old ceremony that is exclusively ours. Following Most Worshipful Gordon, Most Worshipful John Lobdell had an opportunity to preside over 3 such cornerstone ceremonies. The Hampton Academy over in District 1, where an actual cornerstone was placed on the building in this school renovation. I know that it was probably meaningful to him. Following that, he had an opportunity to do the cornerstone ceremony at the New Dover High School, Most Worshipful Lobdell's alma mater. And following that, the Barnstead Police Station in Barnstead, New Hampshire. Our current Grand Master has had the opportunity to preside over a cornerstone ceremony last fall at the First Congregational Church in Farmington. And unless canceled due to the current crisis or rules, he will preside over another on June the 11th, 2020 in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. So I think this very public tradition of Masons is being restored. But what will the community see? For those of you who may not have seen this, at the very least, there will be a processional by the Grand Master and his line, the host lodge, Masons from across the jurisdiction of New Hampshire. And when you get into the ceremony, and it's not a real long ceremony, but the Grand Master presides, and he asks, that the respective tools of the office be applied, the square, level, and plumb. And in this very meaningful ceremony, the appropriate individuals do so. And the Grand Master, having received the report of the application of those respective tools, declares the work well done. But then there's a second part. Following his declaration, the application of corn as an emblem of plenty, the application of wine as an emblem of joy and gladness, and asking the great universe, the ruler of the universe, to bless and prosper our nation, cities, and unions of the states, directly addressing the community that we serve. And finally, the application of oil as an emblem of peace, and asking that the Grand Master of heaven and earth to shelter and protect the widow and orphan, all bereaved and afflicted the enjoyment of every good and perfect gift. So here we have in this very public ceremony, where we're talking about Masonry to the community in this very solemn ceremony, and yet there's an additional significance to all of us as Masons. And the ceremony finally concludes with the Grand Master asking that the corn, wine, and oil and all the necessaries of life abound among men throughout the world. He asks the blessings of Almighty God on the undertaking of the building, protecting the worker, and asks that the structure be planned with wisdom, supported by strength, and adorned by beauty. How Masonic is that? And again, very public. But you know what? I want to shift to some additional cornerstones, and as the Grand Master opened with tonight, and which I believe Right Worshipful Brother Olson is also going to speak to, we've heard about his 4 pillars of Freemasonry as communication, ritualistic excellence, education, and retention. And I want to address for those entered apprentices and fellow crafts, who might be on this call, there is yet another significance which you should already know about relative to a cornerstone. As you have heard, the northeast corner of the lodge is especially significant to Freemasonry. We've all heard that piece in the EA degree where as an EA, we're standing in the northeast corner as a newly made entered apprentice, and the worshipful master commands us to ever and walk strictly in charge as such. And that applies to all of us tonight. We heard earlier that a building is traditionally started with but a single cornerstone, a perfect stone in the northeast corner, and having been found plumb level and square, perfectly laid, provides the solid foundation from which a building is built. And whether operatively or speculatively, each stone must be found square, level, and plumb. But how do we achieve that in operative masonry? I think if we picture that perfect ashlar as the state of perfection that we all aspire to, doesn't it make sense that we should apply each of the 4 pillars equally? And I know I did this last week, and I think it makes sense, and I'm sure the Grand Master will tell me if he disagrees with my math equation. But I think if we put it in a math equation, ritualistic excellence plus Masonic education, and that includes discussion among us as brothers, plus communication equal retention. And retention is the sum of the parts. So I think one of the things I want to say tonight is that each of us felt the call to masonry in our heart. And to our EAs and our fellow crafts, and yes, to our master masons, having been found worthy, you embarked on a journey and you have received the benefit of whatever degree so far that you are entitled to receive for now. And in a very life-changing way, you are being presented with an opportunity for spiritual change within that unearths that which was always there, but that you now seek to uncover. It is your journey, and one that we want to provide every resource to assist you. But you know what? I think it comes back to these 4 pillars, because you have to be compelled from within to do all of them. Because it's kind of like, if we have it, I'm sure we have some engineers on here, and certainly there can be shortcuts in the construction and not following the plan. And at the end, we may find that the building, the individual, looks like a Mason, acts like a Mason, but when trouble comes, when hardship comes, it's then that structure, or you individually, will be exposed. That's a little bit of a harsh word, but I think that's what it is, because if you don't follow the building plan, then the building is weak. And when troubles come, it becomes apparent. So don't shortchange yourself. We can't monitor that. It is up to you, and we are with you, and we want to make sure that the outcome for all of us is that we will be square, level, and plumb. We want you to be a solid stone in this building, this speculative building that we call Freemasonry. For all of us on this call, we know that it is a lifelong labor. And I think that there are a number of ways that we can also apply this whole concept of cornerstones. If you are a cornerstone within, it's your obligation to guard that west gate. Our cornerstone is also within, and it's each of us, you know, having that cornerstone in our heart and our inner foundation, so that we continue to smooth that rough ashlar, which we all seek to do. And I think that we have to seek knowledge at all times, Masonic knowledge. And we do that through our ritual, certainly, and through discussions with each other, Masonic education, if you will. I think also that we as a group, you in your individual lodges are a cornerstone in your lodge. And when you have like-minded people who are working in concert, not necessarily in lockstep and not necessarily agreeing on everything, but our basic foundations are in accord, then you as a lodge are a cornerstone in your district. And we have all of those lodges in a district doing that, then you are a cornerstone in this jurisdiction. And when all of our districts are doing that, then we are stronger. We are building a better jurisdiction. So I think that if you were to picture this thing called Masonry as the cornerstone of Freemasonry, then each of us becomes the blocks or bricks that build the temple. And I suggest that we do that to be plumb, level, and square. And like that operative building where great craftsmanship and diligence was applied, a magnificent sum of the parts emerges, and we work on ourselves individually, but are strengthened, challenged, and inspired. Remember the cornerstone above, and the stone being declared square, level, and plumb, and the further depositing of corn, wine, and oil on the stone. Well, let's take that public ceremony, and while the public is hearing the word, we as Masons may remember that corn, wine, and oil are symbols of abundant gifts from the Supreme Architect, and that we may give thanks for the blessing described by King David as wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face shine, and bread which strengthens men's heart. And I think in closing, I believe that a Renaissance in Freemasonry is here. It is not one driven by numbers. It is not one driven by competition with community clubs, but rather it is embracing the four pillars of Masonry equally and diligently by pursuing that which we were first called in our heart and which we came here to do. And so I think my closing message tonight would be a cornerstone, be a part of the Renaissance, do the work, and most importantly, enjoy the journey.
Right, Worshipful Acreage, that was excellent. It was educational and it was inspiring. You do have one question, and I know that you were a real pillar in your community with the work that you did in Dover in setting up that cornerstone event.
Yep.
There's a question there. I don't know if you can see it or not, but
why is it so hard to make public officials aware of our cornerstone ceremony and the need for advanced planning? Well, you know what? That is an excellent question. Because one, it requires one kind of knowing what's going on in your community. And I think one of the difficulties that, well, I want to back up a second because I think there are two things. One, like much stuff, when we tend to cut things out, perhaps not intentionally because we don't have the numbers or it requires work or we don't have the people to do it, what happens is it gets forgotten. And all of a sudden it becomes a tradition not to do that anymore. But you know what? We have seen this resurgence, and the best way to do it is this whole ceremony. I think a lot of public officials are wary of that it's going to be some type of religious ceremony, although there's certainly some religious overtones. And they're worried that if they open the door to us, it has to be open for others. And I think it has to do with an education, and it requires one-on-one with various officials. And if you're already involved in your community, you can strike up the conversation. I can tell you that the Right Worshipful Smith, who put the whole thing together at the Capitol, well, he was on the committee. So he said, well, you know what? The Masons should have a place at the table. And they did. In the case of the Dover police station, it was a long process. They have a joint building committee. And so you had the city council and you had the school board, and we had to present what the ritual was, and we had to answer a whole bunch of questions, but it paid dividends. Well, guess what happened after the first one? When we went back for Dover High School, we didn't have to go through that anymore. It was like, yes, let's do it. So I think, my answer to that question is just reach out to them, talk to them, educate them. There are also, I know that the First Congregational Church ceremony was filmed. I know that the Dover ceremony is actually on YouTube. When Worshipful Greeley over in Farmington decided that he would like to do the cornerstone ceremony, Pastor Ken at his church had some questions. So we went over and I went over and I sat down with him. I showed him the YouTube video. I showed him the ritual that we would be doing so that he can reconcile what we were going to be doing with his particular church. And it was not an issue. He was very comfortable after that first meeting. So that's probably a really long answer. But here's the thing. If you're having trouble in your community, then please, call me, email me. And there are others that have organized these. I know that Right Worshipful Cumming was instrumental in doing the Barnstead. He set that one up. There was a gentleman from St. James Lodge that did the Hampton Academy. Right Worshipful Smith did the Capitol building. So you know what? If you need to handle the politics, if you have the relationship, reach out to one of us, because you know what? We'll work with you. We'll go over there and help explain it if you need us to.
All right, very good. And I know that Right Worshipful Brother Cumming pointed out the fact that there is there's a document, a pamphlet that can be used to help guide. So if you need access to that, please contact the Grand Lodge office. And Right Worshipful Busby also pointed out the YouTube link for those that want to see the cornerstone ceremony. So Right Worshipful Brother Eckridge, I want to thank you so very much for an excellent presentation. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Right Worshipful Brother Olson. Brethren, you should know right up front, I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, that Right Worshipful Brother Olson did experience a tragedy in his family this week. And I did call and ask if this is something that he still wanted to do. And he said that he did. So I would ask that you keep both Brother Olson and his wife, Tina, in your thoughts and prayers. And I'm really looking forward, Carl, to what it is that you're going to share with us this evening.
Thank you, Most Worshipful. First, apologies. I'm running a little technology challenged here, maybe using some older technology. Hopefully everybody can hear me, and the video may end up being a little bit balky, but we'll deal with that as we go. I'm looking forward to being very, very entertained by my program as soon as I figure out what it is. What I had intended to talk about this evening, brethren, was handwritten rituals and handwritten ciphers as they apply to our craft. And scattered in front of me, I have several examples of that. But as I sort of started my way through that, I ended up down a rabbit hole a bit and said, gee, this really lends itself to first a discussion of a little bit about our ritual, where it came from, what it is, what it does, and such. We tend to think of our ritual as this very static never changed. The word came down from on high to Preston. Preston passed it to all of us, and such it is to this day. But to go back and look a little bit before that and to follow along after that, is really interesting to see that our ritual is actually something that's dynamic, that's changed a little bit over time. A lot of the lessons, the core values haven't necessarily changed, but there have been some revisions, there have been some changes. And I think it's interesting that I've been going through a lot of our proceedings recently. And in one of the proceedings, I actually found a comment that said the deputy who was sent out to visit a lodge gave a short history of the various attempts that have been made to establish an uniform mode of working in America. So some of you may be familiar with the Baltimore Convention. Some of you may be familiar with some other efforts. So brethren, I'm just going to kind of throw a quick question out there, and certainly don't expect responses, but just for you to think about these comments. Do you suppose they were made in the beginning of the 19th century, before the Morgan Affair? In the later in the century? The Baltimore Convention was actually 1843, or these comments that maybe even were made up sometime into the early 20th century in the 1900s. So, chance to think about it, these were comments that were made by a deputy who went to visit Washington Lodge in Exeter, August 5th, 1805. So as far back as 1805, they were talking about a uniform mode of working in America. And it wasn't something that was new once we got to the Baltimore Convention, which I'll talk about in just a second and very briefly. But I also find it interesting that as I started looking through these proceedings, from the time Grand Lodge was founded in 1789, we did not have our first, well, his title then was Grand Lecturing Master, until 1805. So for the first several years of our Grand Lodge, we did not have a Grand Lecturer. In 1806, interestingly enough, there was a committee formed between New Hampshire and Massachusetts to look at resolving a uniform code of lecturing and a regular system of Mason's work. And in 1806, that committee moved for the adoption of the Webb Lectures from 1797 from Thomas Smith Webb. I mentioned the Baltimore Convention of 1843. And at that time, there was no adoption of a national standard. There was some talk of an imperial Grand Lodge or a Grand Lodge for the whole United States. That didn't get passed. But interestingly enough, out of that Baltimore Convention in 1843, adopted by our Grand Lodge in December of 1843, was the use of a book called the Masonic Trestle Board by Right Worshipful Charles Moore and S.W.B. Carnegie. And New Hampshire ordered that the same be used by the several lodges as a guide and textbook. And right here, I have a copy of that book. This is a much later, this isn't an 1843 version, but this one, which says Masonic Manual on the front, if I go inside, says Grand Lodge of New Hampshire, and the date on it is actually 1946. So this book was essentially all of the information that you would find printed in plain text in our cipher books that you see later. So things like the charges and the prayers and some of those things. And that was sort of the origin of some of our ritual. And that was actually adopted 100 years before that volume was published in the 1840s. In 1900, I did see something very interesting in his comments. The Grand Master made a reference to not being a big fan of some changes that were made to the third degree charge. And there's a reference in there to a particular piece of poetry, which evidently was added right around that time. So I'm sure we're all familiar with that piece of poetry right at the end of the charge. Evidently, that's something that's only a little over a century old in our ritual. Shortly after that, in 1901, they actually decided that maybe the district deputy grand lecturer should have a printed ritual. So fully the first 100 years of their existence, our district deputy grand lecturers didn't have a printed ritual to go by, or any document at all, it would seem. So I mentioned that that one was Grand Lodge's first sort of book. Well, the next book that I have, and it looks like my video is a little blocky, so I'll talk about it. I've got it held up and hopefully the video will catch up, is actually dated 1948. And the title page says, Official Cipher. So for those that may believe that our first cipher was that 1960 cipher that we work from, this one is set up exactly the way that the Black Book cipher that we use today is set up, with the same type of code inside. So we see that the start of the use of that book goes back to just before 1950. So I found that to be very interesting. And then, of course, the Black Book, as we all know it, came along in 1960, and then there was the White Book that we won't talk about, that we're all aware of and is out there and has been an issue that everybody's familiar with. So as a historian, I don't feel the need to talk that much about it. In going through and collecting some of these things, one of the books that I found, and you can, looks like that video is just coming up that's showing that cipher from 1948. One of the other things that I found was this particular volume, which is a small leather brown book, and inside is a handwritten cipher. And the interesting part of this handwritten cipher is we can identify this to an individual, because his warrant to work as a grand lecturer was included with this. And this particular cipher was the property of a brother Sawyer from Warner, who was a grand lecturer in 1840. So many of the changes that I talked about are after this document was produced. So going back and examining this document lets us look at what some of the ritual might have looked like before some of those changes were made in 1843 and even years later. So that, before I had mentioned that, I just wanted to also mention that, of course, the only recent change to our ritual, to that cipher book, is the addition of the two words in front of the penalties in each of the obligations. And that dates back to the late 1980s and was a subject of great concern when it was originally discussed, was adding that. Now, in looking at a couple of other, I just got a couple more books that I'd like to sort of show off a little here. The first one belonged to a brother Simons from Kentucky and dates to 1915. And it looks like my video may be running a little bit better, so I'm going to get this one up. Hopefully it's close enough that folks can read it, or at least make out detail on it. Let's see. So you can see that this guy was just an amazing penman. And as you look through these various volumes, their penmanship was incredible. And there are no little scribble outs anywhere. I don't know if anybody has worked and spent a lot of time mentoring your candidates, but there are little scribble marks all the way through their books as they do that aid to the memory. So one of the things that I've discovered as I've done some of this research is, when I had first seen handwritten rituals, I thought that the brothers just made their own handwritten rituals. But what I found looking at more of this was, because that penmanship is so accurate, and because there aren't any little corrections where somebody made a mistake, in all likelihood, these books were either books that they made once they were advanced Masons, once they had learned all of the ritual and were able to go back and write that out by hand. Or in some cases, I've actually found lesson books that were created by the lodge for a brother to study from. So I think that some of these books may actually have been created by sort of the master ritualist in a lodge, and made available to other brothers, or may even been given as gifts. And I've got one last book that I want to show you. This one actually belonged to a brother Clarence Page, and it's interesting because on the first page of this, it's noted when he was made a Mason. And again, my video is being real blocky, so doesn't want to pay attention. He was raised in 1888. He took his EA in January. He was passed in February, and he was raised in April. And it's interesting because he's done a handwritten cipher with just the letters, much as the cipher we know today. That quickly came up and showed you those dates. But it's interesting because in here, he didn't write out everything that would have been printed in plain text in one of our ciphers. All he did was make a reference to that manual, that Masonic manual that we had talked about that had been approved from the mid-1800s. He just said, manual, page number 57. And if you go to that, then you find that charge, or that prayer, or whichever portion of the work needed to be done. So that led me to kind of an interesting view of where things came from. What I had originally thought I might work on was to show you something along the lines of a pigpen cipher, which would look similar to this. And this is where you get the encryption that you see occasionally in a ritual, where you'll have something that looks like a backwards L or something that looks like a 7, and those equate to letters. But the only references that I can find to these is it says they were used in the 18th century in Europe. So I've not found any in the United States. I have found some rituals that were printed for a national audience that did use some symbols to denote the officers of the lodge and such, but none of those were New Hampshire rituals. They were sort of a generic version of a ritual, and you could work it to your own needs and necessities. The thing that I did find in these New Hampshire rituals was they did have sort of a shorthand where they had a little symbol that they made for the word "the." And once you figure out what those symbols mean, then it makes it fairly easy to read, but it was just a shorthand, so they didn't have quite so many letters to write out as they wrote the ritual. So brethren, hopefully that tells you a little bit about the history of our ritual, and alludes to the fact that it has changed over time on occasion. As I said, all of the lessons are still there as they were. All of the intent of that ritual is still the same as it was. And they weren't frivolous updates and changes. They were either standardizations or just seemed to make our ritual better. I do have these books available. So this is the point where I offer a sales pitch that once we make it through COVID season for Masonry, if you would like to invite me out to your lodge, I will bring these books with me, show them off to your lodge, and talk about the evolution of our ritual and let you see some of these books from the late 19th century and beyond. Would love to do that, and may even look at possibly putting some of this together into a format that Brother Busby will be salivating over, because it'll either be a PowerPoint or maybe a video that might be able to be added to the Grand Lodge website if I can break some of this down. So with that, Grand Master, I hope that was educational and filled the Masonic education pillar, and where it was a discussion of some of our ritual. I don't know as it led to ritualistic excellence, but certainly was a discussion of our ritual.
No, it was fantastic. Right, Worshipful, I very much appreciate you presenting your insights to us. Always valuable. So, brethren, if I can just provide you with a summary for this evening's activity. So you heard from myself giving you an update on the state of the state, if you will, which translates to communication. You heard Right Worshipful Brother Patuan speak about Masonic protocol, and you heard Right Worshipful Brother Ackridge speak about our cornerstone ceremony, and both of those tie very closely into ritualistic excellence. You heard Right Worshipful Brother Ackridge through Cornerstone also help to explain Masonic education as it relates to that ceremony. And then we just heard Right Worshipful Brother Olson speak about the history of our ritual. So as Brother Ackridge said, I think he said it very well. You have elements of ritualistic excellence. You have elements of Masonic education. You have elements of communication. And when you bring all those together, what they provide to the membership and to the brethren on this call this evening is value. And when you have perceived value in your precious time, that leads to retention, because it means you got something out of it and you want to come back again. So, brethren, I want to wish you all safety and security. I hope you are all abiding by our governor's order to stay at home if possible, or to practice social distancing. I want to thank each of you for joining tonight. My understanding is that we once again had over 80 members that joined us tonight. So I think we are providing value to the membership. That's what we're really trying to do. I want to thank you all so very, very much. There's a comment here. I have a handwritten ritual that was my grandfather's, Ray B. Currier. He was master of Fraternal Lodge number 71 in Farmington in 1926 and 1927. Well, Worshipful Brother Greeley, I have no doubt that Worshipful Brother Olson, as soon as he is able, will be knocking on your door. I'm sure he would love to be able to see that. So, brethren, thank you so very much for spending time with us this evening. I look forward to seeing you eventually on the trail. Hopefully, we have another opportunity to host another one of these Grand Master Q&A sessions, as well as the Grand Line. So until I do physically see you again, I wish you all safety and security. Good night.
Night, Most Worshipful.
Good night.
Good night. Great
Thank you so
meeting.
much for joining.
Good night, Most Worshipful, and everybody.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.